All right, we should be live. Thank you for joining us today. I'm not one to hype up my videos. I'm not one to say that you got to watch this video, it's the best video ever. I'm also not one to jump to conclusions. I like to look at all of the data. However, Lloyd has been researching the last couple weeks. He's been digging into a new topic, and he presented some of his findings to me yesterday. And I just had this feeling that he's really on to something. This is something very big that could change our understanding of primitive Islam, if you even want to call it Islam. Whatever you call it, proto-Islam, primitive Islam, not the standard narrative, not the Islam that developed in the 9th century, but what was actually going on in the 7th century. So we're going to take a first look at this evidence. We haven't fully scrutinized it. We haven't connected all the dots yet. And we wanted to get your feedback on it. We wanted to get people's feedback. So by all means, tell me live in the comments. If you're watching this later on a replay, comment down below. We want to hear your feedback. We want to know if this is a credible line of evidence, if this is something that we should continue to pursue. Because like I said, my first impression is that this might be the missing piece of the puzzle that explains where Islam came from. So Lloyd, you want to say any quick words of introduction before I open us in prayer?
Um, yeah, everyone. My name is Lloyd de Jongh. For those who get confused about how to say my name, because there seems to be a lot of that going around. And thanks, Thaddeus. Yeah, I mean, yesterday when I bounced this off Thaddeus, his response to me was blown away by Thaddeus's response, because I was kind of like, what do I make of this that I'm finding? And I had to talk to Thaddeus, and Thaddeus was echoing my thoughts. Like, I mean, this could be highly significant. So yeah, I mean, so we'll throw it out there. This is not as well prepared as my work typically is, because it's thrown together rather rapidly. I've been working on this, and a couple of weeks I spent, and I was going down a lot of dead ends, and then suddenly it's like, suddenly you find a lead, and then things just start to unravel. So we'll just see how it goes. But I think we found a route within Jerusalem which explains Islam, which is yeah. I mean, so you guys will this will blend a lot with what Jay is saying, with what Mal is saying, and others. But I believe I'm adding something that they've missed.
Excellent. So let me go ahead and lead us in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you today asking to guide us to the truth. We ask that you lead this discussion to the truth, that you help us discern between what is coincidence, what is error, and what is the truth. We believe that we are on to some important information about the development of Islam information that will shake the Muslim world. However, we don't want to accept something just because it's damaging. We also want it to be true. Uh, so help us to resist the temptation to believe something simply because it sounds good or it sounds damaging to Islam, and guide us to what is true. We know that Islam is false for many reasons. So we don't need to hold on to any particular reason against the evidence. We ask that you be with us today and that you guide our discussion. We ask that you be with the audience, that you help them perceive what is being said to be true, and that they remember what is true and they give feedback on that. And we also ask that you guide the audience to point out errors or point out missing connections or logical leaps that we may be making. With that in mind, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with people around the world and share these ideas. We thank you for living in a time where we're able to put together all this information from different times and different places, things that would not have been possible in a previous time. We ask that you use this technology to help us reach into the Muslim world, to shake Muslims from their false demonic religion and help them come to the truth of Christianity. I ask that you be with myself personally, as well as Lloyd, and that you give us the strength to persevere today. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So here we go. We haven't yet told you what the topic is. We just kind of alluded it to. So give us a couple words of introduction of what we're going to be talking about today, Lloyd. Specifically, what have you been looking at the last couple weeks?
So it's a church in Jerusalem which was destroyed and buried. It was found about 30 years ago. And its significance is, I think, only being realized now. And this church seems to be the predecessor from an architectural point of view of the Dome of the Rock. So its design was incorporated into the Dome of the Rock. But there are certain other factors to this. This church was also a major pilgrimage site. It had a well where people would go and drink sweet water, and they would take away liters of water from the well, which reminds me of another place that had a well. And this church also has a rock in this inside of it, which reminds you of another place which has a rock inside of it and the well. And there's a bunch of other things related to this particular church, this specific church, like no other church in the world. There are certain stories related and attached to this church which made their way directly into the Quran, unambiguously, explicitly made their way into the Quran. And this is all attached to this church. And so I'm going to go through the evidence today, present it. As I said, some of this is fresh. Some of this information, the discoveries are less than 24 hours old. So some of them are literally just hours old because I've been working on this. And once I finally found my feet here, I started to unravel things. So yeah, so Thaddeus, just on what I've said, what do you think of the basis of that?
Yeah, looking at the evidence. So Lloyd first proposed an idea related to this church. I don't know, maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago to me. He pointed out that they had kind of an odd understanding of Mary, and it might help to explain the uh, the Quran's claim that Mary is the nephew of Moses and Aaron. And I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. I wasn't saying that it was wrong because Islam's borrowing from all kinds of things, but just borrowing one random thing from this particular church, that's interesting. But then he's been finding more connections, and he started to look at the dome and the similar architecture. And I'm like, well, that's pretty interesting. That is odd that they're copying the architecture of a church not that far from the Dome of the Rock to build this building. But, that could just be practical reasons or that, the church was particularly important or strong building in the area, and they either wanted to copy it because they wanted to do what Islam does and take over the society that's there and turn it into an Islamic society, or they just liked the architecture or whatever. But then he kept bringing more things, and then last night he told me about the water, and I was like, hold on a second. You were previously telling me how this church has a special connection to the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew, one of the um, pseudographical, written long after the time of Jesus, written in the 5th, 6th century Gospels that the Quran copies from, that it is clearly influenced by. And then I'm like, wait a minute, not only does this sound very similar to what goes on at Mecca now, but it also has a connection to that story. Because in that story, in that you know non-historical fantasy story that someone invented, Mary is very thirsty. She's in the desert, and the infant Jesus produces a miraculous spring from below her. And I'm like, hold on a second. this story that we know the Quran borrows from this gospel, this text. This story could be the origin of the Zamzam well, the miraculous spring. And all they did is they changed it from being about Mary to they changed it to something else.
Yep.
We already know that there's a good indication that Islam was originally developing up in the north. The empire, the first Islamic empire, all the rulers were up north, all the important hadith collectors and whatnot, they're up north. And then it migrates down to the Mecca area. Why isn't it possible that they just took what they were doing at this church and brought it to Mecca? I'm like, okay, there's too much here. There's too much going on. There's too many connections to this one specific place, this one specific time. There has got to be a real connection here.
Yeah. So let me jump in. Let's just start with the evidence, just lay it out and see what everyone has to say and what they think about it. So let me start here. It starts here. I'm sharing my screen. Do you see me, Thaddeus? Yep.
Yeah, it's loading, and there it is.
Should come up in a moment. Okay. It all started when someone in the comments, and thank you whoever that was, they mentioned something about the Church of the Kathisma. So I looked at this as like, okay, so I went to have a look and I started searching and I couldn't find much. Ultimately, long story short, I come across this book by Stephen Shoemaker. Now, Mal has started using this. I don't know if he started using it before me or after me, but whatever. Now, at least this author's work, right? I know previously there was a different book that has been quite. Anyway, this one is called Creating the Quran, a Historical Critical Study by Stephen Shoemaker. So let's go have a look and see what he says. And it started here. So I found this. They say this is the case of the Kathisma Church and the Quranic nativity tradition in Quran 19, verses 22 to 28, which I've discussed elsewhere in some detail. And this leaves little question that we must approach the Quranic text as a corpus of traditions that remained open even beyond Muhammad's lifetime. We're going to start finding that numerous scholars have been saying the Quran was in development long after Muhammad died. It was being added to and altered continuously after Muhammad's death. And it was continuing to absorb Jewish and Christian traditions in the decades after the believers, before they were called Muslims, they used the term believers, conquered and occupied the Near East. So the Quran gives a highly compressed account of the birth of Jesus that depends on a distinctive combination of Christian nativity traditions that is uniquely found outside the Quran only in one place, in the liturgical practices of a particular shrine to the Mother Mary just outside Jerusalem called the Kathisma Church. In the vast world of late ancient Christianity, it is only at this church that we find combined the two early Christian traditions that appear in the Quran's account of the Nativity: Christ's birth in a remote location rather than in Bethlehem, and Mary's refreshment by a miraculous palm tree and a spring. For good measure, we must add, the liturgical traditions of the same shrine also explicitly name Mary as the sister of Aaron, just as in the Quran's nativity account, at last providing a clear solution to this well-known puzzle of the Quran. And it states here, clearly the Quran knows and expects its audience to know this particular series of Christian traditions. Now, he goes on to say that the people in the Hejaz, these Arabs vastly far isolated from Jerusalem, would not be expected to know the details of a story which is specific to a particular church just outside Jerusalem, literally halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So he says, no, this must be part of a group that is familiar, intimately familiar with this. Now, what is fascinating is at one point, this church, before it was actually taken over and converted into a mosque, so it actually was a mosque at one time, so the Muslims were well aware of it and used it. But at one time, it was actually a place where Christians and Muslims prayed. It actually has a prayer niche. So they actually joined, Muslims went there and they had their own little section where they could go and do their own worship. Thaddeus, your thoughts on this, what I've said here so far?
Yeah, so we have a couple independent lines of evidence that Islam started as kind of this ecumenical movement, if you like, or you put differently, it started as a system of conquest, and they were just trying to make all the various religions that they were conquering, or the religions of the lands they were conquering, happy by kind of creating this symbiotic relationship where they take a little from here, a little from there. Hey, we got something even better now, right? So that seems to be what Islam started, and they called themselves the believers, right? They didn't call themselves Semitters, they didn't call themselves Muslims, they called themselves believers. We're the people who believe in God. Whatever tradition you come to understanding, and we all kind of believe the same thing. Of course, that's not the reality, but that's kind of the argument being made in this early proto-Islam. And at this church, we see evidence of that. We see Jews and Christians and Muslims kind of worshiping side by side, coming together and being friendly with one another because they're united under this cause of conquest.
Right. Okay. So let me now. Okay, let's get into the presentation, and I will bring up some other things. So we're going to discuss the Kathisma Church, the first Dome of the Rock. This is my first run through of this material. I'm not as familiar with it as I would be if I had taken much more time. But let's present it. We'll look at the evidence, lay it out, and get familiar with this as we go. This is the Kathisma Church. The Kathisma means seat. This is where, according to the biblical tradition, Mary was with Joseph and she was leaving and she was tired and she sat down on this rock. And this little motif here, this palm tree, is something that is important within Islam. It's important within the pseudo-epigraphical texts and also associated specifically with this church. So, the Kathisma Church is located on the Hebron Road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. I've got 21 slides or 20 slides plus some other references. Once it was nearly as important as the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. It actually had importance. It was a place of pilgrimage, and it was forgotten. And in fact, scholars were looking for it. Scholars had wondered where it went, and it was accidentally found while they were building a road. A digger struck rock and they discovered it was this church. It took them a while to discover just what the church was. And notice, you can see in the background here the shape of the church. It's a double octagon with this little circular border here around a rock in the middle. And this is the rock on which Mary sat. Now I want you to notice on the bottom right corner, I have here, this is the Dome of the Rock, right? Notice the entrances, okay? Notice the shape here, and notice the Dome of the Rock has an identical shape, right? The Dome of the Rock has an identical shape, and also these little round circles here, these are pillars. Now, this church also happened to have pillars. So the entire concept, the whole idea, and what is interesting that is, as we will learn, is that the reason for the octagonal shape of this church was that it was to set itself apart from, to distinguish it from all other churches, and to mark it specifically that the octagonal shaped buildings were churches specifically dedicated to the Mother Mary. In which case, this begs the question, why is the Dome of the Rock in the shape of a Christian church dedicated to the Mother Mary?
Yeah, that's definitely a very good question. Why is one of Islam's most holy sites copying the design of a Christian church dedicated to Mary?
Yeah, so I did invite Mal, just so you know, Villainous, I did invite Mal, but unfortunately he wasn't available. He said he'll watch it tomorrow, but yeah, so we did invite him on. I did invite him on for this. Okay, let's continue. It's a 5th century church that may offer insight into the history of the Dome of the Rock. The southern apse was made into, we'll look at all those details, was made into a mosque in the first half of the 8th century, while the rest of the structure continued to be used as a church. This picture here contains the prayer niche. I think it's this section here. I can't be 100% sure, but this is the section that contains the prayer niche, the Muslim prayer niche, before it was converted into an actual mosque. Now, the church was apparently attacked and destroyed multiple times. And because I have records of 641, I've got records of the 8th century, so somewhere in the 700s, and then eventually, once the the Crusaders were defeated, the Muslims destroyed it and buried it. although there are still references to the well up into, I think, the quite late in the 19th century. So this area, but it was buried under the ground in an olive grove before it was discovered in 92. So this is, yeah. So oddly enough, it's got too many links to this Dome of the Rock. So scholars hold that the church was destroyed during the Persian invasion in 614, although, as from what I've read, there are at least three episodes of destruction that occurred. These ruins of this double octagonal Byzantine church were found while building a road. The shape is important to understand and compare with the architecture of the 5th century that influenced the Dome of the Rock. And in fact, this was the first church to incorporate this specific styling, which then influenced later buildings, although it might have been influenced by earlier buildings, well, specifically the home of Peter or Peter's mother-in-law. But we'll continue. Notice this is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And you'll notice you've got this church here with a dome. So apparently, this church would have had a dome because the dome motif is not especially Islamic. The idea was actually used by the Christians. Look at the Hagia Sophia, for instance, right? So this idea, and these churches were let. This was deliberately let to fall into disrepair and eventually disappeared. So the dome motif would be associated with buildings of this type. Right. It's a double octagonal shape, and it has a rock in the middle. This is this is to the east, this is the north. So the north is up here, this is the east, this big shape here on the east, right? West entrance, and here's the Muslim prayer niche on the bottom in the south entrance, right? And there's also a palm tree mosaic. You saw that when I opened up, there was the palm tree mosaic on the main slide when I opened up the cover slide. So there's multiple chapels situated around it, and you've got what's called an ambulatory, right? Within this double octagon, there's a thing called an ambulatory. Now, oddly, obviously, the Dome of the Rock has exactly the same structure, and the ambulatory is designed to give you access to view the Dome of the Rock, no, the rock itself as you move around. Any comments before I go on? And also, this thing rivals the size of the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was built more than 200 years later, and it's only 10 meters larger.
Yeah, so just to emphasize a point you made about domes. So in early Christian history, it was very common for churches to be built with domes. Because it was so difficult to build a dome structure, it kind of was seen as a reflection of the power and glory of God that you could build this structure that seems to be unsupported, right? You look up, it doesn't seem to be anything supporting the dome. And with the technology of the time, they don't have steel and whatnot. It's literally just the weight of the rocks pushing against each other that's kind of holding it in place. So that this was seen as a very glorious sign. So there's lots of early churches built with this structure. Not like super early, before when the church was highly persecuted and underground. Obviously, they're not building elaborate structures, but when the church starts to peacefully take over the Roman Empire, and they now have access to all the resources of the land, they're starting to build these fantastic structures. John says, I think the structure of the dome has been added to over time as well. And that's correct. At least according to the commonly accepted history of the dome. It was burned down a couple times, rebuilt.
11 times. It's been destroyed 11 times.
Wow, 11. I didn't know it was that many. I knew it was like at least 3 or 4, but 11. Wow. So they, had to be rebuilt. The only parts of it are original. Now we do the generally accepted history is that at least some of the walls are original, and because they discovered uh, sayings on them that possibly predate the writing of the Quran, even talking about how Christians are outside of Islam, right? That they have been rejected. I forget the exact which of the Quran verses it is, but it's one of the anti-Christian Quran verses is found on the walls there. So if we're thinking that maybe Islam started as this ecumenical movement and they were sharing this space in the Cathedral Church, then they later build the dome when there's a break coming, when they're feeling that the Christians are not with them and they are their own group. They take the same structure, they repeat the structure, but they're like, this one is ours. This is the real Cathedral Church, if you will. And that's what we now call the Dome of the Rock.
Yeah. Also, I want to highlight something. Let me bring this up. This should be this is from my series Monotheism. Some of you, let me just enlarge this. I want you to know this is the Kaaba, right? Everyone knows well, hopefully by now, that the Kaaba predates Islam and is claimed to have been first built by Abraham and his son Ismail, though there are no archaeological findings to support this argument, as we're also aware. The pre-Islamic Kaaba was rebuilt several times by the tribes ruling Mecca, who used it to house sacred objects, including the Black Stone, which is interesting, a rock inside of a holy church sort of temple setup. During the lifetime of Prophet Momo, the Quraysh tribe rebuilt the Kaaba with alternating courses of stone and wood, which was the style of church building common to the Ethiopian Christians. The inner space was divided into two rooms, one of which housed the Black Stone. The interior walls were decorated with paintings of Abraham, Mary, Jesus, angels, prophets, and trees. Now, if you ask yourself what kind of trees, well, you're going to find out, I believe the answer is palm trees. Very specifically, palm trees, because the Islamic narrative, as well as the Kathisma church narrative, relies on palm trees. And so notice the Kaaba itself, it is admitted in the Islamic sources, there were paintings of Mary and Jesus. So now you've got, again, this connection to Mary and Jesus, the whole Kathisma set up with the rock, right, which is linked to this, and palm trees. So I'll
Yeah,
take that away.
I'll add.
Yep.
I'll add that the pseudographical gospels, the pseudo Matthew and infancy gospel of Thomas, have the story of uh, Mary being miraculously fed by a palm tree that Jesus commands to bow down to her. Uh, so the palm tree is super important in these texts. It's one of the central miracles that they're drawing on to show that Jesus is God and Mary is the mother of God. And here it is in Islam. And I failed to point it out earlier, but the rock here, the rock in the Cathedral Church, is said to be a place that Mary sat down, right? She sat down on her journey. She was tired. I think that the rock is supposed to be marked by her sitting down on it, like there was a miraculous um, mark
No, the water flowed
sign
from it.
that
So
that
where
she
she
sat.
sat down, water flowed, which is very similar to the whole, but I'll get into the whole Kaaba thing and the
Yeah,
whole Zamzam well thing. So, yeah,
but
so let's run a little
what I was going
faster
to
because,
say,
yeah,
yeah, what I was going to say is, of course, there is a rock at Mecca. It has a different purpose, right? It doesn't have the same purpose, but it's very odd that there is a rock at the center of Islamic worship in Mecca, and there's a rock at the center of this church.
yep. So this is the church from overhead. This is a high quality shot. This is a high res shot of the church. This direction is north, as you can see here. All right, so this line here is to the north. So let's have a look. This is the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is 4.8 kilometers this direction. This is Bethlehem. This is the Church of the Shepherd. Notice the Church of the Shepherd is also octagonal. Oddly enough, it's also an octagonal shape. That's in this direction, roughly 4 kilometers. The Church of the Nativity is also 4 kilometers away. So they're both basically the same distance away from the center of this church. So the Dome of the Rock, not that. So this is roughly halfway between Jerusalem, between the major points in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, right? Now, this again is an indication. This is the shape, roughly the same alignment. This is the shape of the Dome of the Rock, and you can see you've got the pillars. So these little things here are where the pillars stood. You see, so you've got these pillars as well that stood around. We'll have little pictures of those later, but you'll see there were pillars. So the design is very, very similar. Right? The design is very, very similar. So this style, this design is a well-known design, which was copied here, right? So let us continue. So the Theotokos, what is that? Is the alleged place where Mary rested on the road to Bethlehem. The source for this generally is the Proto-Gospel of James. That is the Proto-Evangelion of James, and it's got another name. It was built when Marian devotion first rose to great importance following the First Council of Ephesus of 431 AD, which was the council dealing with the Nestorian controversy. One of the earliest churches dedicated to the Theotokos in the Byzantine Empire, if not the earliest church. It was built under the guidance of Juvenal. He was Bishop of Jerusalem. He was a participant in the Ephesus Council. The Nestorian controversy, for those who don't know, and was a discussion over whether Nestorius was basically saying that Jesus had two natures. He was schizophrenic. He was two separate people in one body, one divine, one human. And of course, this went against orthodoxy, which is Jesus is one, you've got one body, but two natures who are joined but separate. The divine with the human. Don't quote me on that. All right. But Thaddeus, is that close enough for
Yeah,
a decent
yeah.
answer?
So, we're just real briefly, we're often told that it was a debate over whether Jesus was divine or not. That's incorrect. All sides agreed that Jesus was divine, and people even go so far as to say, this is when Jesus became divine, but that's not the case. The debate was over the nature of Jesus's divinity compared to his humanity.
All right. Yep. So this is connected to the introduction of the earliest strictly Marian feast, the celebration of the Theotokos, which was inaugurated by Juvenal at the Kathisma. It is set on the 15th August originally, and then it's moved by 2 days to 13 August to make place for another Marian feast, the Assumption of Mary, which is basically, it's got multiple different names, but for the death of the Mother Mary, right? And her assumption into heaven. So let's continue. The church was built in 456 AD. Some information will be repeated, partly because I haven't edited everything yet, but partly just to reinforce. It was built in 456 AD, 5 years after the Council of Chalcedon, which reaffirmed the decisions of Ephesus and finally granted Juvenal, Bishop of Jerusalem, ecclesiastical independence on the same footing with Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch, meaning that this church was on the same level as these other major churches in these major dioceses. So it was not a minor church, it was a major church. It was recognized as a proper diocese all of its own, and as a very, very important place of pilgrimage. Just stop me anytime
Yeah,
if you
so
want to add anything,
a
Thaddeus.
question
Now,
here from Nicholas,
yep,
which is not popping up on the screen for whatever reason, but he says, quote, it's got another name, which I believe is something you said, and he said, can you expand on that? The Theotokos is the Orthodox.
no, I was talking about the proto
Ah,
gospel of
gotcha.
James, the proto evangelium. There's a third name people also call it. That's what I
Very
meant.
good.
The proto gospel, the proto evangelium, and it's got another name. They call it the Gospel of James. There's some other name that it also goes under.
Very good.
The infancy gospel of James. It's also called the infancy gospel of James. So that's what I meant.
And
Okay, Candlemas.
Juliet,
Yep,
one other comment from Juliet here. Octagons are used in every Islamic structure. Probably symbolizes the eight angels calling Allah's throne.
carrying.
And the question, I guess, is which came first, right? The architecture or the explanation for the architecture?
I mean, look, you can make up anything. You can steal something and explain the story for it afterwards. I mean, they make it up as they go. So, I mean, you know, this is Islam we're talking about. Okay, so now onto Candlemas. The church is connected to the introduction of the earliest strictly Marian feast, the celebration of the Theotokos, inaugurated by Juvenal at the Kathisma. The church and monastery of Kathisma were built, so there's a monastery attached to it, right? There's a monastery attached to it. Were built by a wealthy widow called Achalia, also known as Aquilia or Hycelia, during the reign of Bishop Juvenal of Jerusalem, roughly 422 to 458 when he died. Theodosius is said to have lived in the monastery as a young monk. Would that be Emperor Theodosius? I'm assuming that this is related to, right? I'm not sure, but Theodosius is said to have lived in the monastery as a young monk. Achalia introduced a candle procession to mark the purification of the Virgin Mary at the temple in Jerusalem 40 days after the birth of Jesus. This is a very ancient Jewish custom. This, shall we say, is a Christianization of this Jewish custom. The custom spread to much of the Eastern Church and later to the Western Church. It is known as Candlemas. So, just for those, I had to go and look this up, but without getting into too much detail, according to Mosaic law, a mother such as Mary, who had given birth to a male child, was considered unclean for 7 days. She was to remain outside the temple for 33 days more. If the woman had born a daughter, then she had spent double time outside the sanctuary. When the time, 40 days, was over, the mother was to bring to the temple a lamb, blah, blah, blah. Okay? 40 days after the birth of Christ, Mary complied with this precept of the law. She redeemed her firstborn from the temple and was purified. So this is the whole idea. This whole idea of Candlemas is related to this Jewish custom. So then you have Candlemas. Now, it is located in an olive grove within the southern municipal borders of Jerusalem on land owned by the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. It is bordered in the south by a terrace with a well. In Arabic, the well is called Bir Kadismu or Bir Kadismu, right? Now, the size of the church and its sophisticated octagonal plan indicate that it was of great importance. Surrounding the flat rock, which is its focal point, were two octagonal hallways. The inner one as a walkway called the ambulatoria, from which the worshippers could view the stone seat. The outer hallways divided into rooms and 4 chapels. It was surrounded by a square envelope divided into rooms with mosaics on the floors, right? Nearly all the rooms of the church were paved in colored mosaics. Some were added in the 8th century. The mosaics are in the shades of red, yellow, and green in floral and geometric designs, which, if you start thinking about Islam, geometric designs, mosaics, that kind of thing, the Dome of the Rock, there may be a parallel there. Okay, so there are multiple of these motifs, including horns of plenty, cornucopia, and grape tendrils and whatnot. Okay, and according to the 6th century life of Theodosius, the church and the monastery of the Old Kathisma were built by the wealthy widow Icalia. It was built on the resting place of Mary, halfway on the road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and dedicated to Mary, the bearer of God. Now, it's important that the whole idea of the reverence towards Mary, was important because finally, when Mary was declared the bearer of God, right, not just the bearer of Jesus, the man who was later adopted by God, or Jesus who was possessed by a god, right, which is basically what Nestorianism would be. When she was the mother of God, this meant that the whole question of whether God was divine was kind of settled. But we'll get into that. But it was very, very important. So then obviously she became someone who's highly revered as the bearer of God himself, not just the bearer of a man who was later on, you know, supposedly turning into some kind of crazy mixture, according to the heretics. So Saint Theodosius lived in the 5th century, was sent for training as a monk to the monastery called the Old Kathisma, because it was falling apart. And from the 12th century onwards, a water cistern or well in this area was noted as a holy site. Now the well was there from the early start, but there are records from the 12th century discussing it, and it served as a refreshment and rest station for pilgrims traveling on the Jerusalem-Bethlehem road until the end of the last century. So the well is still there. The well is still well known. Now, this is the church here, and this is the view towards Jerusalem. This is all that's left. You can see here, you've got these pillars, right? And you got these little places where the pillars were standing, these little square things. I don't have, if you look online, you're going to find dozens and dozens of photographs of it. There's plenty of them, but the design is quite interesting, and of course matches the Dome of the Rock. So it's mentioned in ancient sources. You can interrupt anytime if you need to, Thaddeus. So the Cito Terrae Sanctae, the 6th century, and it claims that the influential Byzantine court official Eubricius had the rock cut into rectangular shape like an altar and intended to have it moved to Constantinople, but no one was able to move it beyond Jerusalem, St. Stephen's Gate. So it was placed in the Church of the Resurrection right behind the tomb of Jesus, where it was used for the Eucharist. So a portion of the rock was cut off, which means the rock was considered important to those, within the time, with the church at the time, the rock was considered important. The location was considered important, so a portion of the rock was moved. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, I was about to jump in here actually. So you're telling me that the rock at the Kathisma was broken into pieces. Does that sound like another important rock you know of?
There's no rocks in Mecca that were broken into pieces.
Okay, okay.
You
My
know,
confusion. I was
I
just
deny the
thinking that
allegations and I deny the alligator.
of course, just in case anyone's not familiar, the black stone that's central to the purpose of the temple at Mecca, uh, it was broken into pieces at one point, supposedly by um, during war. The conquering general broke it apart. Maybe he was trying to destroy it, or maybe he was, just like in this story, trying to take a piece back to his homeland, to put in his own um, palace or whatever, so that he had a piece of the genuine there. And of course, the use of artifacts to connect to saints, to connect to places and times and things related to Jesus, very old Christian tradition.
Right. I've mentioned this before. The original text called the Vita of Saint Theodosius, 6th century, a hagiography of Theodosius, the Synobiarch. So the Vita Theodosi by Cyril of Scythopolis, blah, blah, good grief. Okay, so I've mentioned that already, but Theodosius lived in the monastery as a young monk, and as a young monk. The octagon shape of the church can be seen in other early churches and structures. St. Peter's house in Capernaum, Mount Gerizim near Nablus, Shechem, and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. According to scholars, the cathedral was the original design for these later structures, and its unique architectural design was copied to the other structures. It is also larger in size than the other two churches. Okay, it's also larger in size than the other two churches. I'll just mention here, for instance, this is St. Peter's house in Capernaum, obviously, which would come prior, right? Now, someone's going to say, well, it wasn't Peter's house. It was actually the house of Peter's mother's, father's, uncles, cousins, nephews, twice removed, best friends, third uncle's cousin, right? Yes, I know. But notice the shape here. This is a very Christian shape. Yet, you've got a little, see this here? You've got this whole design, pillars and so on. So this design is clearly Christian. Thaddeus, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two possibilities, right? Either this really was connected to the Apostle Peter, or it wasn't. But either way, it is very early and it predates anything Islamic for sure.
Yep,
And it probably is the inspiration for those other ectonical churches, at least in the Jerusalem area.
yep,
So whether it actually was owned or by Peter or his relatives, or he lived there, is basically irrelevant to this point. Someone might say, "Oh, that's not St. Peter's house, therefore it doesn't count." Well, it does count. It was used as a Christian site of worship, whatever its original purpose, and was the inspiration for these other things, including ultimately the Dome of the Rock.
yep. And then over the years, pilgrims also marked other traditions at this location, the cathedral, including Rachel's tomb, which is very, very close by. And I sent Thaddeus some notes yesterday. Rachel's tomb is very, very important within Jewish history. And because of the very tight integration at the time with the Muslims who are copying Jewish history and Jewish culture and tradition, this would also have been something significant. So now let's have a look here. This is St. Peter's house in Capernaum. And here you've got the interior. Now this is a zoomed in section of the Dome of the Rock. I've zoomed in very tight here. But notice you've got the little circle and you've got the double octagon. And then of course you've got wells, cistern, cistern, cistern. Okay, water, water, water. Very important for some reason that they have all these wells, right? And let's just continue here. So very important they've got all these wells. But this shape, by no means an accident. I mean, if you look at the overlapping design, this is just crazy. Now, the cathedral well, the excavators found a clay water pipe near the rock. An early tradition says a miraculous spring appeared there to quench Mary's thirst, to quench Hagar's thirst when she needed to give Ismail water. Sorry, did I just read it? And a 6th century account tells of pilgrims drinking sweet water from the Zamzam well. Pilgrims could remove up to 4 liters of water from the holy water well to take with them. Now, just out of sheer interest, there's the same story happens to be told about Hagar within the Quran and with Ishmael, and of course, sweet water comes from the well, and of course, pilgrims take water away from the Zamzam well. Okay. So from Mecca, the drink of life, Muslims bring home revered Zamzam water after annual pilgrimage. And this was a site of pilgrimage. So Hajj pilgrims returning to their countries can now take Zamzam water on board international flights from Jeddah Airport. I've actually flown out of Jeddah Airport a couple of times. So yeah, that does happen. Okay, so this is another little overlap in terms of the design. I just wonder if I should bring up this file just to see if there's anything of importance here. So the Kathisma, Christian and Muslim pilgrimage site. I believe it's this one. No, not that one, not that one, not this one. Yeah, the Kathisma, a Christian and Muslim pilgrimage site. So this is something that I recommend you guys have a look at if you have a chance. This is a very interesting paper. You can download this one for free. Okay. And this is something that was very important to people traveling on that road. Okay. And it's very much connected to the circumstances of Christ's birth. Okay. And the pregnant Mary. And these ideas we'll discuss further. Okay. I didn't highlight anything here. So there's nothing. Yeah. Okay. I didn't highlight anything here. So I'm not going to go into this paper now. Okay. Now, traditions regarding the well. From the excavations report by archaeologist Rina Avner, the exposed remains were ascribed to two phases of the Byzantine period and to three strata dating to the Ottoman period and the Middle Ages. So there's some sort of connection to the Ottoman period. Now, the Kathisma well, or Bir Kadismu or Kadismu, is the name of a pool adjacent to the Kathisma church. The open-walled hole is located between the monastery and the road that connects the Har Homa neighborhood. Tradition holds that Mary stopped here to drink from the well on the way to Bethlehem and therefore is a sacred place. But of course, when she sat down, the spring opened up. There was a miraculous event that water was provided to give to her as well as food. Okay. According to tradition, the three wise men witnessed the star when they camped by the well on the way to Bethlehem. In Matthew 2, verses 1 to 9, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east. And therefore the well is also named the well of the star. So in other words, this well is connected to a major story of the Nativity, right? And it's called the Well of the Star, and tradition holds that the wise men stopped there and camped at that place and then went to Bethlehem. So this is not just a minor location. This is a major location which disappeared for hundreds and hundreds of years. The well was excavated in 2000 and a square was opened on its northern side, and this allowed them to date the reservoir to the Byzantine period. So this was it. So the well wasn't always this big hole in the ground. Okay, it was much smaller. We'll see a picture of it later, right? But this is what they did, which allowed them to date this well. Now, this kathisma is Greek for seat. The church was named the seat of Mary. It's in the area called Ramat Rachel, or Hebrew for Rachel's Heights, named after Rachel, the wife of Jacob. So it is specifically situated within this area. So it's located within a very, very important area related to major biblical figures who, according to the Bible, is buried in Bethlehem, which is 4 k's to the south. And as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan in the way, yet there was but a little way to come unto Ephrath, and I buried her there in the way of Ephrath, the same is Bethlehem. So Har Homa is Hebrew for mountain wall, a large new Jewish neighborhood. Now, it is named after a wall built over a Byzantine church, which was seen from a Ramat Rachel outpost. We now know that that Byzantine church is this church. Okay, so this neighborhood is named after a church, which they've now since discovered. This would be the Kathisma church. Bir is Arabic for well. The site was occupied into the Byzantine period and probably later. About 8450, a church, a monastery, and other buildings, collectively known as the Church of Kathisma, were built on the site. The Arabs destroyed all of these. The monastery, I believe, still exists, and the Arabs built these really tatty buildings on top, and so they didn't preserve the site. The name is derived from Greek kathisma, seat, right? And of course, let me see, the final phase of occupation was during the early Arab period, during which only a few poorly constructed buildings covered the site. Your thoughts before I go on, Thaddeus?
Yeah, so just real quick, there are people getting off topic in the chat. Please stay to the topic that we're discussing today. So just a quick note on that. Now, as far as the material goes here, I think this is very helpful background material, understanding the traditions of this church. To me, it seems likely that the tradition of the well and miraculous spring developed before the texts that I referred to earlier, right? This tradition goes back further. This is a tradition that's around, and then it makes its way into those pseudo gospels, and then it makes its way into Islam, which then raises the question: where is Islam borrowing it from? Is it borrowing it from these texts, like we've previously thought, or is it Islam developing in this region in the same cultural milieu, they're pulling directly from the culture as opposed to pulling from these specific texts.
Anything else? Because then I'll just move on. So now this church, now it's intimately involved with Ramat Rachel, right? So it's very much involved with a very famous monastery. It's very much involved with Juvenal. It becomes a very serious place, becomes a place of pilgrimage. It's a very important archaeological site. And not only that, it's on the path from, it's literally built on the route halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And pilgrims stop there to get their water, right? To get their Zamzam water from this place. So Kathisma was more than just a church, it's martyrium, a witness to the faith. Archaeologists describe it as a martyrium, a structure intended to bear witness to the Christian faith by commemorating an event in the life of Christ, a martyr or other holy person. The importance of the structure is shown by its width of 43 meters, only 10 meters less than the octagonal dome of the rock, built more than 230 years later, also enclosing a rock. Three concentric walls surrounded the Kathisma rock. The first two formed a walkway leading to a large apse at the eastern end. The third wall encompassed four chapels and adjacent rooms. Most of the floors are paved with colorful mosaics in geometric and floral designs. These are well preserved but covered with sand to protect them. Excavators found a clay water pipe near the rock. An early tradition says a miraculous spring appeared there to quench Mary's thirst, and a 6th century account tells of pilgrims drinking sweet water at the site. This matches the Muslim tradition. To continue, now the building was shared with Muslims. This is a view of these little stands where the pillars would stand, and these are broken pillars here. Again, matching the design. This is the, as I mentioned, the Muslim prayer niche. This is another oblique angle of, and this is the road running right there, right? So they literally slammed into this thing. An excavator, hit into the rock, and luckily they just changed the road's angle to account for this. So this is what is left. That's the center there with the rock. Okay. So it escaped destruction during the Persian and the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. Evidence of a prayer niche facing Mecca indicates that part or all of the building was used as a mosque in the 8th century. It seems that at one point there was an ecumenical movement going on where Muslims, as I said, could go there and pray, but at one point they took it over and made it into a mosque. It seems then that this was a place of contention between the Arabs and um, the Templars.
And
Bearing
just
in mind yep.
jumping in real quick, that's kind of the pattern of Islam in general, right? They come to an area and they're like, oh, we can just all be friends, we can all get along, and then they get enough power, and suddenly it's, no, we can't. We're taking over all your stuff, and at best you get to be our slaves.
Yep. Yep. So, right. So this was used as a mosque in the 8th century. So bearing in mind the respect shown by the Quran for Mary, even if actual Muslims don't show such respect, experts speculate that this may have been one of the few churches that was shared by Christians and Muslims during the Arab period. So this actually ties in with other things that I've said in the past, where there was an ecumenical movement where the Muslims, before they were called Muslims, were the believers, they were trying to have this whole movement where you had the Jews, the Christians who were worshiping, and the Muslims worshiping one God, right? Where God was one, right? And of course, eventually the Muslims, to set their own identity, broke away, right? They stopped being called the believers. They took on the name of a small minor Umayyad group, and they became the Muslims. But there was this ecumenical movement. They were called, and of course, you had the leader who was called at that time the Amir al-Mu'minin. And the Mu'minin were, just like you have Muslim, you have Mu'minin, being a prefix, right? Those who worship or those who follow, those who do, those who serve. And the min comes from the Hebrew meaning heretics, right? Menin being plural of heretic, right? Menin, plural of heretics. So those who are heretics, the Jews called them heretics. Such harmony did not exist in the middle of the 20th century when the site was on no man's land during hostilities between Jordan and Israel. The 1949 Armistice Agreement, the Green Line, runs across the property. In the 1990s, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, which owns the site, had plans to develop a major pilgrimage center, but these did not happen. Okay. Now, what is the proto-evangelium of James? Because these secondary sources, these non-canonical sources, which did not make it into the Bible, did make it into the Quran, though. The Quran was very good at copying secondary sources, pseudepigraphical sources, just not copying actual biblical sources. But it's odd that they did copy the one set of actual, well, at the time, the Greek Orthodox scriptures or ideas that they took were taken specifically from this church, from this location. Right. So, any thoughts on that, Thaddeus?
Uh, Not directly related to that, but to what you just said previously, Sola Scripturis is one of Allah's names is Al-Mumin, the believer. Um, I'm not familiar with that, but I think he's probably correct. But what the heck is Allah believing in? Himself? I don't know. Weird stuff.
That's kind of weird. That's really weird. Like Allah praying to the stars. You're like, huh? Okay. Or swearing on the stars. So now the Proto-Evangelion of James. It's a second century infancy gospel on the miraculous conception of the Virgin Mary, her upbringing and marriage to Joseph, the journey of the couple to Bethlehem, the birth of Jesus, and events immediately following. It is the earliest surviving assertion of the perpetual virginity of Mary, meaning her virginity not just prior to the birth of Jesus, but afterwards. It was condemned by Pope Innocent in 405 and rejected by the Galatian decree around 500. Yet it became a widely influential source for Mariology. The Gospel of James was well known to Origen in the early 3rd century and probably to Clement of Alexandria at the end of the 2nd century. So it is assumed to have been in circulation soon after 150 AD. The author claims to be James, the half brother of Jesus, by an earlier marriage of Joseph. But in fact, his identity is unknown. So early studies assumed a Jewish milieu, largely because of its frequent use and knowledge of the Septuagint, right? A Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. Further investigations demonstrated that it misunderstands and or misrepresents many Jewish practices, which oddly enough, so does Islam, right? But Judaism at this time was highly diverse. In fact, there were lots of heretical sects at the time. And recent trends in scholarship do not entirely dismiss a Jewish connection. Its origin is probably Syrian and possibly derives from a sect called the Encratites, whose founder, Tatian, taught that sex and marriage were symptoms of original sin. Now, the Gospel of James is a midrash, an elaboration on the birth narratives found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and many of its elements, notably its very physical description of Mary's pregnancy and the examination of her hymen by the midwife Salome, suggests that it was attempting to deny the arguments of Docetists and Marcionites, who were heretics who held that Jesus was entirely supernatural. It draws heavily on the Septuagint for historical analogies, for turns of phrase, and details of Jewish life. And Ronald Hawk and Maria Foskett have drawn attention to the influence of Greco-Roman literature on its themes of virginity and purity. So that's the Proto-Evangelion of James. We'll have a look. And then it's also known as the Infancy Gospel of James. This text tells the story of the travel of Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. In the middle of the road, Mary requests to rest and descends from the ass that she is riding. And they came into the middle of the road, and Mary said to him, "Take me down off the ass, for that which is in me presses to come forth." And he took her down off the ass and said to her, "Whither shall I lead thee? Whither shall I lead thee and cover thy disgrace? For the place is desert." Now, this is interesting because Hagar comes with Ishmael to a place that is desert, right? And then she's desperate. She's thirsty. She's hungry. The baby wants to eat. The baby's crying, right? Well, not the baby. I mean, but Ishmael at that point is like 10 years old or something. But the place was desert and Ishmael was dying, right? And then, of course, water miraculously springs forth. Well, Mary sits down and water miraculously springs forth. So, any thought that is before I continue?
Does sound a lot
I'll
like,
continue, then I'll jump into more.
yeah,
Yeah,
does sound a
sorry.
lot like the story of Hagar in Islam, right? She's traveling in the desert and she's really tired and she sits down and water springs forth. And here, Jesus is about to be born. In that story, uh, Ishmael is an infant. So another similarity. Very interesting. By itself, I would say definitely these could be unrelated stories. They definitely uh, could be with only looking at that one piece of evidence by itself. But then when you combine all of these pieces of evidence together, it does seem like the story of Hagar has been borrowed from this tradition about Mary.
So let's continue. So this is from the Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a magazine that takes stories in archaeology and makes them public, right? It looks for stories from archaeologists that have impact on the Bible. So in this infancy narrative, Mary is the daughter of a wealthy but long childless couple, Joachim and Anna, who vow to give their unborn child to the temple in gratitude. So the story appears to be patterned after the story of Elkanah and Hannah and their son Samuel in 1 Samuel. So the story is basically borrowing from the Bible, right? And then it's further borrowed by the Muslims and stuck into the Quran. From the age of 3, Mary lives as a ward of the temple like Samuel. And this story also makes its way right into the Islamic narrative, right? In the temple, she's fed by an angel. When she's grown, the high priest Zacharias is called to find a husband for her by assembling elderly widowers and having them draw lots. One of them is Joseph. Each of the widowers is given a rod. A dove comes out of Joseph's rod and flies onto his head. A sign from God that he is the man. At first, Joseph refuses, fearful that it will be a laughing stock when she does not conceive. It will be seen as his fault. He's an old man and she's a young virgin. Now, hold on. First of all, this is not out of the Bible, right? This is fan fiction.
Mhm.
Except the Quran actually takes many of the elements of this story. And if I do in the future, when I talk about these stories from the Quran that are literally taken straight out of Jewish mythology and Gnosticism and other sources, right, which are completely just, as I said, fan fiction. But notice Muslims are always complaining that Joseph was an old man and Mary was about 2 months old, you know, and this claim is actually straight out of this source. The claim that Muslims make against Mary actually comes out of a out of a non-canonical source, out of a fictional source. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, this is the pattern we see in general with these so-called alternate gospels, these texts that are trying to expand the biblical story, that they very interestingly don't talk about or only make vague mentions of the things that are found in the canonical gospels, and then they expand in all the missing areas, right? Missing, and that Jesus's childhood, what happened then? Well, someone's using their imagination trying to think about what may Jesus's childhood may have been like. They tell stories about it. Or in this case, the question is being asked, what was Mary like when she was growing up? Uh, and then the Quran says, I'm confirming the gospel. I'm confirming what you already believe. And it confirms these stories that are found in these other texts. And as you pointed out, uh, there's still some cultural familiarity with these things in Islam today. If you read the tafsirs, for example, you read the early tafsirs, often they're filling in details from these sources to explain the Quran. Like, they knew what was going on. They knew where the Quran had got these stories. Now, they may have thought they were biblical stories, but they're not. This is not the revelation that God has given us, and the author or authors of the Quran couldn't tell the difference. And because the original Muslims knew where these were coming from and they talk about it in their commentaries, there's still a memory of it in Islamic society, and they draw a polemic. They even draw polemics from this text, right? Oh, your text says that Joseph was an old man and Mary was a very young girl. No, it doesn't. The text that you think or your Quran thinks is the Bible might say that, but that's not our text.
Yeah. Now, the Quran, in fact, this story of Mary being fed, by angels and all of that, this is entirely from these deuterocanonical sources, from these, as I said, fan fiction of the Bible, right? Which is known to be fan fiction, but the Quran actually treats it as legitimate biblical stories, which clearly they are not. It's again heresy that Allah somehow is copying and pasting. And yes, they were fooled by fan fiction. So now Joseph, of course, needn't have worried. So Mary falls pregnant without Joseph's intervention. He comes home one day and finds her 6 months pregnant and accuses her of infidelity. And of course, blah, blah, blah. Then we have our story. Now, this is the picture of the well. This is the entrance to the well. Okay, this is the actual well, which probably would resemble something like the original well of Zamzam way back in the day. All right. Now, let's look at the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. Now, just so we know, the earliest manuscript of Pseudo Matthew, now not the Gospel of James, now Pseudo Matthew, is 820 AD. In 2011, Michael Berthold identified that one of its sources is the Pseudo Ambrosian life of Saint Agnes, which is used by another work around 690. So this source is earlier than that. St. Agnes is thought to have lived in the 5th to 7th century. Other, more speculative arguments suggest an earliest date of the mid-6th century for Pseudo-Matthew. So you've got a date of anywhere from 550 to 800. Okay, so these are very late sources, which the Quran is copying. Anyway, let's go on. The child Jesus, with a joyful countenance, reposing in the bosom of his mother, said to the palm, O tree, bend your branches and refresh my mother with your fruit. And immediately at these words, the palm bent its top down to the very feet of the Blessed Mary, and they gathered from it fruit, with which they were all refreshed. After that gathered all its fruit, it remained bent down, waiting for the order to rise from him who had commanded it to stoop. Then Jesus said, Raise yourself, O palm tree, and be strong, and be the companion of my trees. There's the sword, which is very common to the Islamic. So take Saudi. Well, what kind of tree do they have on their flags, Thaddeus? Would it be palm trees?
I believe so.
It's palm trees, right? The symbolism is all palm trees. Raise yourself, O palm tree, and be strong, and be the companion of my trees, which are in the paradise of my Father. And open from your roots a vein of water which has been hid in the earth, and let the waters flow, so that we may be satisfied from you. And it rose up immediately, and at its root there began to come forth a spring of water, exceedingly clear and cool and sparkling. When they saw the spring of water, they rejoiced with great joy and were satisfied, and all their cattle and beasts, and therefore they gave thanks to God. So now you've got two apocryphal stories talking about miraculous springs of water and other stories, which the Quran actually discusses as legitimate stories about Mary, right? Which is so Islam literally copies these stories, ascribes them to Mary, and everyone knows these are just fiction. Right? Any comment before I go on, Thaddeus?
Villainous said more fan fiction, and indeed it is. Um, but to emphasize the point I said earlier, I think that the legend of the water springing forth at the Kathisma site probably developed first, and then later this text, the Pseudo Matthew, is written, and it incorporates that existing legend. And then the Quran, either directly inspired by the culture of Malu that believed in the legend, or because the author read Pseudo Matthew. Either way, the Quran says that this is part of the true revelation of God that he's confirming, but it was always
Yeah,
just fan fiction.
yeah. So I think I've got one more slide after this, and then I'll go to another source, and I'll wrap this up. So Quran 19:22 to 26. And then she conceived him. Yeah, and Jesus was speaking from the womb, as someone pointed out. I mean, so Jesus not even born yet, but he's okay, fine and well. So then she conceived him and withdrew him with him to a remote place, desert, right? Remote place, which is what Hagar did, right? Withdrew to a remote place. And the throes of childbirth drove her to the trunk of a palm tree. Again, the palm tree symbolism. And she said, Oh, would that I had died before this and had been a thing quite forgotten. And the Kathisma church, the tree that is symbolic of the Kathisma church is the palm tree. So a voice came to her from beneath her, Grieve not, surely the Lord has provided a stream beneath thee, and shake towards thee the trunk of the palm tree, it will drop on thee fresh, ripe dates. So eat and drink and cool the eye. Then if thou seest any mortal, blah, 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 blah. So Stephen Shoemaker, he used the book that I introduced in the beginning, which discusses the source of these stories of Mary, the mother of, sister of Aaron, and so on. He identified a precursor to the Mary palm tree story in a set of early 5th century texts at the latest known as the Dormition of the Virgin, which is about the death of the Virgin Mary, for which we have later 5th century Syriac manuscripts as the earliest textual witnesses. And these Syriac manuscripts come up all the time. This version was widespread throughout the Byzantine Near East by the end of the 6th century. In this version, the infant Jesus commands the palm tree to bow down and provide fruit, as in Pseudo Matthew, but it is already located by a stream rather than the stream being a second miracle, as in Pseudo Matthew and the Quran. Nevertheless, this is proof enough that the story was developing in the region well before the 7th century. So that's from Stephen Shoemaker, right? We introduced him early in the beginning. So now there's a couple of books that are worth having a look at. The Dome of the Rock in light of the development of concentric martyria in Jerusalem, architecture and architectural iconography. This chapter discusses the beginning of the cult of Mary Theotokos in Jerusalem, in which the Church of Kathisma played a major and influential role in connection with Marian feasts in Jerusalem. It explains the adventurous methodological experiment regarding the architectural iconography of the Dome of the Rock, right? And so on. So I just want to, I'm not going to go on further, but notice this is on brill.com. This is a serious paper which tells you that this church was not just some fly-by-night lame church. It was very important. Now, another paper, the Kathisma, a Christian and Muslim pilgrimage site. This is the style here. Okay. This is the Kathisma church in the 5th century. This is the style in the 6th, right? This is how it changed in the 6th century. So there was over that period, there was a bit of a change in the style and design. Recent archaeological excavations and studies reveal a much stronger emphasis that the early Byzantine history of the road leading south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem loomed large as a holy itinerary, virtually a Christian via sacra, connecting the two most holy cities in the Holy Land. Via sacra would be the sacred route, sacred way, a sacred path. Indeed, a pilgrim visiting the holy places would not miss traveling either on foot or on a beast along a route rich in significant historical memories. And by this road, Patriarch Jacob buried his beloved wife, Rachel. And the church is next to the mound of Rachel, who died giving birth to Benjamin, as told in the book of Genesis. On the same road, the prophet Samuel went in search of a king among the sons of Jesse and picked David. Beyond the Old Testament, other events are recorded in the Gospels and apocryphal literature. So in the Proto-Evangelium of James, we have local legends connected with the circumstances of Christ's birth. One account relates that the 3rd mile from Jerusalem, the pregnant Virgin Mary is accompanied by Joseph. She has a prophetic vision of two groups of people, one happy, rejoicing, and the other wailing. Now, some people interpret this as the Jews who are sad because they didn't believe in Jesus, and the Christians who are happy. And a short while later, she felt the child in her pressing to be born. She asked Joseph to sit down on the rock by the roadside. And eventually, so blah, blah, blah. And let me see if there's anything important here. But again, I just want to mention that this location of this church was not chosen arbitrarily. This location is critical. It's important. It has a lot of significance. It has historical significance. It has religious significance. It is tied to the Old Testament. It is tied to the New Testament, and it became a rich source of fan fiction. And your thoughts, that is, before I go on. Yeah, I'll do like one or two more slides. Then I got to go to a paper that I want to show, and then I'll finish off.
Yeah, I have some comments from the audience, but I will hold those to the end because I want to make sure you get through your material, and I do have another stream later. So I want you to go through your material, and then we'll take these comments from the audience after.
Okay. So just notice this. So okay, let's move on. Now, let's have a look at how precise Islam is with regards to the Hagar story in Mecca. All right. The couple made a pilgrimage, a Hajj, to Mecca, where Adam fulfilled all the rites of that ceremony. Hawa and her first, that's Eve. Adam dug the well of Zamzam with his foot to provide water. Fantastic. Popular legends develop the themes of the Quran and tell that when he was young, Abraham, responding to divine command, escorted him from the family, that's Ismail, and took him with his mother into the desert, where they wandered until they came to Mecca. There, by a miracle, he found the water of the well of Zamzam. Okay, by a miracle he found it. He found it by a miracle. It wasn't just there to be found. It wasn't visible, but okay. Abraham just found it. Let's continue. A different narrative. Hagar founded the well of Zamzam by watching from the hill of As-Safa as a bird was scratching the earth in search of water. When it came out, she collected it so that it would not run off. And as Yaqubi said, this is the well of Zamzam. Now already we have 3 different Muslim stories of the founding of the well of Zamzam. So from Adam did it to it wasn't there, and then somehow accidentally Abraham found it, to she was on the Mount of Safa and she saw a bird. I don't know how big the bird was, but whatever. Okay. One of the narrators of the story comments, okay, in Mujahid's narrative, it was the angel Jibril who dug out the Zamzam well with his heel. I've got another story where a different angel is using his wing to dig the hole to make the well. The history of Homs. Abdul Muttalib rediscovered the well of Zamzam, acting upon a command of God given in his dream. So it was lost. Mecca is the oldest city in the world. Mecca has always been there. The well of Zamzam has always been next to the Kaaba. It's never been lost. It's the oldest city. People have always been there, and it's been lost, and no one could find it. Thaddeus, is this making sense so far?
Yeah, that's great. They rediscovered it, or after they moved the holy site to Mecca, they needed to find a well, so they kept looking and looking, and they eventually found a tiny bit of water. Like, oh, this is the miraculous Zamzam well.
Yeah. So let's use one more version of the story. Ismail, so Ismail's mother, Hagar, runs up the Al Safa hill and then up Marwa. So in the other one, she was on Safa. In this one, she's standing on Marwa to look for help, but in vain. And she hears a voice and then sees an angel, not Jibreel, at the place of Zamzam, digging a hole in the ground until water flows. There's other stories. There's many more stories than this. and then there's an angel with his wing who's digging a hole with his wing. I don't know how you dig a hole with your wing, but okay. And in different ones, the baby Ismail, not the 10-year-old Ismail or whatever, happens to take his heel and he hits the ground with his heel and the water comes out. So there's just a whole bunch. I just want to show a couple of examples. Muslims can't make up their
Yeah, so
mind how this freaking well
we
started.
have all
Yeah.
these stories, they're all different, but we know that Islam is the truth. We know that this is one of the most important events to Muslims because they run between the two hills when they go to on their pilgrimage to Mecca to repeat the events of this one particular version of the story. It's all beyond question, Lloyd. You just got to say that all of the stories that you don't want to believe, and you can decide which one you want to believe, but all the ones you don't
Yep.
want to believe, all of those ones were made by enemies of Islam trying to prove Islam false. That's all you got to do. You don't need to think about it.
So when water pours forth from Zamzam spring, this is not ascribed to an angel, but to the baby Ismail. So now you've got a different source. David Bond, who obviously is using a pseudonym, his name is obviously Muhammad Jihad, right? He says the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Infancy, blowing breath in the bird of mud comes alive, is mentioned in the Quran too as a miracle. This lost gospel, quote unquote, lost gospel, was discovered 200 years, so it proves divine source. David, look, first of all, your name's not David. Let's be honest. Your name is Abdul. Two, that's a joke. That's very funny. You should do stand up. Be back after a Zamzam break. Yeah. And three, those stories are long known as apocryphal. They're known as they come from this is fan fiction. So please
Yeah,
just
let
yeah,
me
go on.
just say this here. So it's a miracle that the Quran borrowed from a source that was extant in the 7th century, but we didn't know about it in the 18th century and then rediscovered it in the 19th. So that is a miracle that it was rediscovered in modern times. And the Quran repeats those words, miraculously proving they're correct, even though this gospel was never considered authoritative, never inspired, just fan fiction. But because it was available at the time of the Quran, but not available when modern scholarship started looking at the Quran and then was discovered, that's miraculous proof.
Yeah.
This is
This
Islam
story
for you,
was
people.
rejected as heresy, as fiction I mean, then already, back in the third, fourth, fifth century, whenever it was created, it was known then to be false. So David, you have to ask yourself, why does Allah copy heresies and Gnostic stories? Why is Allah only repeating heretical and Gnostic stories? All he has is Gnostic and heretical stories from the third, fourth, and fifth century. Like, why is that? Let's continue. Let's finish up here. So, although Jesus is central to, and we're going to go to this essay soon, is central to the New Testament, the Bible is not the only source of information about Jesus's earthly existence. Assyrian legend tells how Jesus spoke and prophesied immediately after his birth. This story is not in the Bible, but it is found in three places in the Quran. Following the course Comparative Text Analysis at the Protestant Theological Faculty in Brussels, we reflect on the question, what is the relationship between the Cave of Treasures and the Kathisma tradition, which is also related to the motif of the child speaking in the cradle? Now, here's something, I found this in Dutch, of all things. I found this in Dutch. I realized there's stuff in foreign languages that we are not aware of. So let me go and find all of this stuff. So the Quran, the Kathisma, and the child who spoke in the manger, I had to translate this. So let's have a look at this. So I'll run through this and I'll probably finish up here. So so what is the relationship in the Cave of Treasures, the Kathisma tradition, and also the motif of the child speaking in the cradle? So I have found a ton of information so far. I haven't had time to go through it all, but this church is significant. So the birth of Jesus takes place in the Quran under a palm tree, a setting that we also find in the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew, which is also a fictional tale which is linked to this church of Kathisma, right? Which is linked to fan fiction. And they speak of themes from Pseudo Thomas are combined with Pseudo Matthew in the Quran. That amalgam is associated by Stephen Shoemaker and Guillaume Dye with the Church of Kathisma, a 5th century Byzantine church located. So this church spawned a bunch of fan fiction because of the idea of the rock, right? So it is certain that the text originated in a Judeo-Christian milieu, not coincidentally the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, So she goes on here. You guys can read this essay. Here's the name of the paper. It's in Dutch. I have it translated. Okay. You will find this. It is called Cathisma and the Child Who Spoke in the Manger. You'll find it in my Google archive. Okay, go look in my Google archive. You'll find it there. Translated. So the shrine at the Cathisma is one of the earliest churches dedicated to the Theotokos. Okay. By granting Mary the title of Mother of God, the discussion at that time whether Mary had given birth to Christ only in his human or also in his divine nature came to an end. So thus, Jesus was God. This was not a case of adoptionism. This was not a case of some sort of heretical belief as others were putting forward. But this is why Mary, the reverence of Mary became important because she was the mother of God. And the Theotokos gave rise to a strong flourishing of the cult of Marian worship, and Cathisma became an important center. The church of the seat of Mary was built on the supposed resting place of Mary, where she sat on the rock. Okay. And according to the proto-gospel of James, she rested. However, we also find descriptions relating it to the Domitian of the Virgin, the birth of Jesus, or the flight to Egypt. Now, briefly, the Domitian of the Mother of God is a great feast of the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Eastern Catholic churches. And it celebrates the death or the falling asleep of Mary, the Theotokos, literally translated as God bearer, and her being taken up into heaven, bodily assumption. It is celebrated on 15th of August, 28th August in the Julian calendar, blah, blah, blah. Let me just see if there's anything important here. Yeah. So Christian canonical scriptures do not record the death or Domitian of Mary. But Hippolytus of Thebes, a 7th or 8th century author, writes in his partially preserved chronology of the New Testament that Mary lived for 11 years after the death of Jesus, dying in AD 41. Now, this may or may not be important. I just wanted to fill that in. So I'll finish up shortly. So the legend of the Quran represents a late version. So the version of the story told in the Quran is a very late version of the story. Leading French Islamologist Guillaume Dye concluded that the verse about Jesus' birth in Surah 19 must have been added by later writers. Because if the Quran is an earlier text, and this version of the story that it's telling is from the 8th century, then this story must have been added to the Quran in the 8th century. Does that make sense, Thaddeus?
It does. It sounds outrageous, right? How could the part of the Quran be written in the 8th century? But,
Yeah.
once we throw out the standard narrative, once we assume that Muhammad revealed the Quran over a period of 23 years, blah, 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 then you have to start wondering, well, did the text develop over time? Was there one Quran that was written, or was there something that was written and then a little bit was added and then a little bit was added? Maybe something was deleted, things were edited. If you allow that possibility, then it doesn't sound outrageous at all.
So the scholarship is saying that the Quran was developing over time. So now, based on the stories, now the origin of some of these versions of these Gnostic tales and these heretical tales and the pseudo-epigraphical tales and so on, the fan fiction, these are late versions that the Quran's included, which couldn't have been around in the second and third, fourth, and fifth, sixth centuries. They came after the supposed finishing the Quran, right? So Dye dates them after the death of the Prophet when Palestine had already been conquered. So the Quran is now containing stories that come after the death of Muhammad. According to this theory, the Muslims who finalized the Quran were already familiar with the tradition surrounding Cathisma, so they had to be in Jerusalem. They had to know the church. They were praying at the church. The church became a mosque eventually. Archaeological excavations show that the church was built in the early 8th century and it was converted into a mosque. No, the church was not built then, but it was converted into a mosque, and this is bad translation, right, from the Dutch. The side chapel also received a mosaic in the shape of a palm tree, right, which was very, very important. Okay. A tradition from Pseudo Matthew can be found in the Quran indicates the text was already written in the 6th century. Okay. So, and they mention St. Juvenal, and they mention here Juvenal and associates laid the foundations for a cult of Marian worship in the octagonal church of Cathisma, which would also be decisive for the spread of the title Theotokos, right? And of course, they mention again the symbolism of the palm tree and the spring, Mary resting, birds of clay figurines. So this brings us to the heart of the mystical meaning of this tradition and to the heart of the worship of Cathisma. The chair in which the Virgin Mary rested during a flight to Egypt was partially moved to Jerusalem, as I mentioned, to serve as an altar in the Basilica of the Resurrection. Now, what is important here, let me just jump to this. During that feast, Mary assumes the role of the Ark of the Covenant. So, Thaddeus, you asked me yesterday if I could find some sort of mystical link. So, here is a
Yes.
mystical link. I don't think it's the answer, but it's something. According to another
Mhm.
legend, the Ark of the Covenant is embedded in the rock of Kathisma, since the Ark and the body of the Virgin are one. Okay, now let's just finish off here. The palm tree is one of the most important symbols of that tradition. He represents many elements: the tree of life and the fountain of living water flowing at its foot, the ark, the rock, the relationship of the church with the resurrection, which brings us to the cave of treasures. And then they speak of the links to the cave of treasures. Mal's been talking about Semitic symmetry, and there's some of that going on here as well, I believe. So I'll finish there, but there's one more thing one last thing. So I'll finish here, I think. I don't need to go any further, but there's one more thing I should mention in that Jerusalem is, according to the mystical idea of Judaism, Jerusalem is the center of the world. It's God's home on earth. And the Kaaba makes the very same claim. Mecca makes the same claim about the Kaaba, right? So they've moved the center of the world. So basically, the center of the universe is linked to Jerusalem, the center of the world, the center of the tree of life. The tree of life is Jerusalem, but they've moved it to Mecca. They've taken it from Jerusalem, moved it to Mecca. This is why Jerusalem was important. It was literally the center of the world within mysticism, within the idea of the idea of the heavens, the whole idea of, remember, you didn't have astronomy then, you had astrology. And Jerusalem was the center of the universe, was the center of the world. And that's why Jerusalem is so important. And notice, I want to mention one last thing. There's a science in Islam called the science of Badi, Ilm al Badi. It's a branch of rhetorical sciences, which is the beautification of literary style, the artifices of the ornamentation and embellishment of speech, which is what Islam does, make things sound nice. So, look, I'll pause there. That's everything for now. What do you guys think? I mean, I've given you a lot of things, but this church is critical. This church is important. There's massive overlap with the Quran. There's massive overlap. This place is the origin of some of these stories, some of this fan fiction that was eventually made its way into the Quran. This particular church, and it was a very important place that was destroyed and disappeared. It was covered up. Look, I would say, knowing Islam's history, they deliberately destroyed it to hide it, and now it's been found, and the history is slowly coming out. And this thing seems to be the origin, in many ways, of. I mean, we can tie stories in the Quran directly to this church. I mean, specifically, explicitly to only this church. This church is the origin of. I haven't got into the Dome of the Rock yet. I'm still working on that. But there's architectural ties, there are mystical ties, there are legends, there are, I mean, just too many things. I'll leave it here, Thaddeus.
Excellent. So I'll take that off. I got a number of comments and questions from the audience. We may not have time for them all, but we'll
Mhm.
definitely take a look at a couple of these. Because like I said, we're just putting this out here right now. We haven't vigorously defended this. We haven't vigorously um, thought it through. We may make changes to our suppositions, but we wanted to get it out there. We wanted to get feedback, and a number of you have already put some of that feedback in the chat. So I saved some comments. I wanted to make sure Lloyd had time to finish. So first of all, before anything specific about the stream here, sorry, Villainous corrected us when we said that it wasn't miraculous to find these texts. He says it is miraculous to get such obvious discreditation of the Quran. So we miraculously found this text that proves that the Quran is copying from human inspired fan fiction, proving the Quran can't possibly be the word of God, and that could be seen as miraculous. Now, I don't think he's actually proposing it as a miracle per se, but it's a lot closer to being a miracle to discredit the Quran than to confirm it, like the Muslim in the chat claimed. Abdullah Yusuf just said this is hilarious. So I don't know if this comment is in joke or he's just posturing and hasn't heard a word. He is actually a Muslim. Um, but do explain to us why you think that it's hilarious that your God has copied his ideas from human inspired fan fiction tied to a specific church at a specific time and place, even though it's the eternal word of Allah from all of existence. And if this was a joke, then you can just ignore me.
Yeah. And
Karen
the fact
says
that
that,
late versions of these stories made their way into the Qurans after the Quran is supposed to have been written. I mean, what does that tell us?
yeah, we got to throw out our assumptions. We got to stop starting with the uh, standard narrative and then trying to make things that we discover fit into it. We need to throw all that out and start from scratch and see where it leads us. And that's how we'll get to the truth. So apparently Abdullah was not
Sorry,
joking.
he was, yeah, he's like, oh, it's the fastest growing religion in the world. So yeah, yeah.
You obviously haven't watched any of the material, which is fine. You just got here. Why don't you hit stop now, go back, start watching it from the beginning, see how hilarious you actually think it is once you actually know what we talked about. And then later, after you've actually watched the whole stream, if you see any mistakes we made, let us know in the comments. But until then, this is just empty posturing, trying to cover up this evidence. I wonder why he would want us to stop talking about this stuff, Lloyd. What do you think?
Because they cannot refute it, and it shows that Islam is really just plagiarism from non-canonical sources.
So, Islamic origins, Mel was briefly in the chat. He said that he had just stopped by for a minute because he was very busy, which is why he couldn't join us live. He apologized for that, which there's no need to apologize for, obviously. We just
Hey,
put this
Mel
together
says
at
I
the last
thinks I
minute.
solved the mystery. That is high praise. Thanks, Mel. You had me very nervous there for the whole day.
Yeah, so, Mel only saw a small portion of it, but he believes that this, based on what we've said today, he thinks that this is probably an example of Semitic symmetry. Like you mentioned that he's been talking about that recently, that the stories about Mary were taken and they were attributed to Hagar due to this idea that the biblical figures are tied together. So he also said that this looks very promising as well. So very good to hear that because, Mel is definitely a free thinker. He's definitely not tied to any particular idea. And it's great to see someone else who has thought about these things saying that there is a connection here.
I'm glad to hear
Nicholas,
that. That's a relief, actually. Yeah.
our kid soon wanted to know the book title, which I'm pretty sure he was referring to Shoemaker's book. I did tell him in the chat, but can you just let everyone know how to find that in
Yeah,
case they
that
were not
one.
here at the
Let
beginning?
me just read through the list of sources that I have used so far. The first one is called Creating the Quran, a historical critical study by Stephen Stephen J. Shoemaker, as in shoemaker, one word. Creating the Quran, Stephen Shoemaker. You'll find it in my archive. The second is a paper called The Quran, Kathisma, and the Child Who Spoke in the Manger by Kelly Keysbury. She's a trained theologian. This is a paper. I mean, she's actually had a seminary and studied and all that nonsense. There's another paper called The Kathisma Church and Monastery of Mary Theotokos on the Jerusalem Bethlehem Road, written by the archaeologists who excavated it. It's a fairly long paper. I haven't looked at it much. Then again, the same archaeologist, the Kathisma, a Christian and Muslim pilgrimage site. So this is, and she works for the Israeli Antiquities Authority. She is one of the very first archaeologists on site to actually she identified this as the Kathisma Church, I believe, or he. I don't know if it's him. And then, of course, yeah, those are some of the sources I've used.
So Scrunchy says emojis in denial isn't a defense for Islam, and Samar says their counter evidence will be every source that agrees with Islam is from Allah. Don't expect any deeper answers. And I have to agree that that the Muslims are going to say this is what we expect. The Quran says it's confirming the previous scriptures. Our religion is confirmed. Now, if you actually bother to think and know why your God is copying from human fan fiction, you might have to reconsider that position because this is supposed to be his eternal word written from before creation, and he's confirming human written fan fiction.
Yeah. So, I mean, for the
So
audience, I mean, Was
Good.
this compelling? Look, this is my very first run through. I haven't finished all the slides. I still got, I mean, it's a little disorganized, even I feel it, but these sources combined, I mean, do you think there's something here? I mean, do you honestly think there's something here? Because this seems to pin down the Zamzam, it pins down the Dome of the Rock. From here, I'm sure we're going to open a lot of doors of information. But your thoughts,
Yep. So,
Thaddeus?
well, I actually thought it was really good. I mean, maybe it wasn't quite as polished as average, but considering you put this together in 24 hours or less, I think that you did an amazing
12
job getting
hours. We
this
spoke
information
last
out there.
night. So, I mean, yeah,
So Anne says, thank you so much for this live stream today. Amazing evidence for the original roots of Islam. Our Kitsune says those are some legit sources. Thanks, guys. Let's see. There's something here. Please go deeper if possible, from Arnold. From Samar, Muhammad was the reflection of his surroundings. He didn't know any better. That's why he completely ignored the Trinity doctrine, putting Mary instead and saying God doesn't have a consort figure. Muslims will never accept this because this will end their credibility and purpose in life. I think this is the start of something. So yeah, lots of feedback from the audience that this is really helpful information. Just a couple quick points that were brought up that I wanted to address. So Mehmet said, don't forget that attribution is a modern convention. To be fair, Muhammad may not have been trying to hide anything, but to present what everyone took for granted from Catholic apocryphal traditions. And I would agree with that. And
yeah.
Mehmet
But
said
he was
that
talking to a group that clearly knew these stories, and these stories were specific to Jerusalem. So he was talking to people that knew these particular tales from that particular place. So, I mean, this pins it down straight into Jerusalem, basically.
Mhm. Yeah, so when people say that Muhammad plagiarized, it makes me a little uneasy because it's kind of anachronistic to say that he plagiarized, um, because that brings in an ethical aspect to this, and it might not like be unethical, right? It might not be unethical for Muhammad or whoever wrote the Quran to be drawing on all these traditions, drawing from these sources, saying they're confirming these sources. The problem is it doesn't jive with Islamic belief that this is God's word. I said what it proves is that this is a human work. Absolutely. You know, that ethical issue, you know, maybe it's not an ethical issue, but it's absolutely proves that the Quran is the work of human beings. And Mehmet agreed with that.
You
Let's
know what's
see.
interesting? There's this guy, M. Lola, or whatever his name is. He says, provide your sources of proof for Terra. Do you have DNA evidence or skeletal remains? And I'd like to say, Mr. Lola, do you have the skeletal remains of Ismail and Hagar that, according to Islamic narrative, is buried between the Hatam and the wall of the Kaaba? So you're talking within a 3 meter space. Ismail and Hagar are buried right next to the Kaaba. Show me the skeletons. Show me the skeletons. Show me the evidence. And the 36-meter long skeleton of Adam is buried near the Zamzam well, between the Kaaba and the Zamzam well. Please show me that 36-meter tall skeleton. We'll believe Islam tomorrow if that's the case. And you have 300 prophets buried around the Kaaba. Show me one, anyone. Take your pick. Knock yourself out. Bring me the evidence.
We have an amazing new theory from Job Borling here that the Bible
Mhm.
was written in 300 AD, which is amazing since we have manuscripts that predate 300 AD. They must have had some time machines as well back then, I guess.
Yep. And what about
But
that guy that was
notice that,
recently saying that we are talking about Islam and not Islam, and these are two different religions, and we're talking about the wrong religion? Remember that guy last week?
yeah. So M. Lola, who's been trying to distract us the whole time by claiming that Christianity is fictional, says, I don't subscribe to any of these fictional characters in both Islam and Christianity. However, M. Lola also got profoundly offended when someone made fun of Allah and Muhammad in the chat. So,
Hmm.
and M. Lola got profoundly offended when I said that they were an atheist as well. So, M. Lola, why don't you tell us what you believe. Since you don't believe in Islam, you don't believe in Christianity, you're not an atheist, but you are offended when someone calls Muhammad names, you're offended when someone calls Allah names. So do tell us what religion you supposedly adhere to. There was a legitimate question here that I wanted to bring up from John Scott. Is there any connection with the palm trees in the church at Cathesma and the palms in the tabernacle?
I don't know. I mean, who knows? It might be, but I mean, I haven't. This is all new material to me as well. I've been working on this for what, 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, I discovered this a little while ago, but it's like I finally made a breakthrough. It takes, this stuff doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time to dig and dig and dig. I have a lot of reading to do. But there is, at the time, within that milieu, there was a lot of symbolism that and a lot of mystical connotation. So I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it were so. But I mean, I try to stick to things that are more tangible and things that I can verify with archaeology and evidence and good scholarship, rather than try to fly off into fancy.
Two last comments here from our Kitsune. If you need Dutch material translated, let me know, because our Kitsune
Oh,
speaks Dutch. And from Mary,
okay.
the original source of the birth between two trees is actually the pagan goddess Leto. So something to look into there.
There is something that I did find. The sources did speak of that. There is, like, they took the ancient myth, and then these gospels, these pagan, not pagan gospels, these fan fiction gospels basically took that idea and they modified it for their own purpose. So yeah, there's a mention of that in some of the scholarly papers.
All
So
right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I
Uh,
think we'll cut it here. I have another stream in 15 minutes. We'll definitely, as Lloyd continues to develop this material, we'll definitely have him on to go more into it. But my first impression of this is that he is on to something really important, something that may shake our foundations of what we believe about early Islam or proto-Islam, however you want to call it, or the believers as they called themselves. And the fact that Mel said the same thing in the chat, that that was his first impression, I think that this is material that is really important. Like I said at the start, I don't hype up my own videos. I don't come on and say, you got to watch this stream. It's going to be the best stream ever. But genuinely, I think that this is one of the more important streams we've had. So we'll definitely look forward to further development from this from Lloyd on this subject as he continues to delve into the material. He told me before we started that he just discovered a bunch of material behind a paywall that obviously we don't know what's in it because we haven't seen it yet, but it seems that there's definitely more out there to be found. So
Thank you.
I'll be back in 15 minutes or so with Mary and a Muslim. We're going to be looking at his objections to the Trinity, having a nice friendly chat. I've had a private chat with him already, so I think it'll be a very interesting chat, a very respectful, intelligent fellow. So you'll be auto redirected to that, and it should start in about 15 minutes. So if you want to do something else for 10 minutes, when you're redirected, just set a reminder and it will pop back up. Any last words from you, Lloyd?
No, thanks, guys. I appreciate the strong support, and Thaddeus for and yeah, and also to Mal. Thank you for the corroboration. Look, there's something here. This is my first run through, but man, there are just too many links. And this church, it just literally dropped off the radar. And now you realize this church was critically important, was actually of major importance in that period. And it's got direct links, literally direct links to Islam, direct links into the Quran itself, right? And it's associated with stories or inspired stories that were added to the Quran after the Quran was supposedly written. I mean, there's something here. There is something here. This starts to it doesn't contradict what Jay's been doing, what Mel's been doing. It gels with my stories previously of the Gnostics and all the stuff that went into Islam. So man, these things are starting to merge. Things are changing. Something is coming together now. We're finally finding these missing pieces, I think.
Absolutely. Uh, Thank you, everyone, for joining us. One thing I did forget to mention is that there's a link to Lloyd's channel in the description. If by chance you're not subscribed, make sure to go over there and subscribe. There's also a link to his archive. He referred to how you could get some of these documents on his archive. There's a link to that in the description as well. So thank you for joining us. God bless. See you again soon.
God bless. Take care, guys. Bye.